Hi, good evening, everyone. Welcome to BIC Streams. Bangalore International Center, or BIC, is an inclusive and neutral platform for informed conversations, intellectual dialogue, exchange of ideas, and the arts. Today's session is The Memory Collectors, Intergenerational Creative Engagements with Partition Oral Histories and Archives. In this session, we have filmmaker Bani Singh, visual artist Arpita Akhanda, and oral historian and writer Aanchal Malhotra and Urvashi Butalia to engage in a discussion centered around the intergenerational impact of partition, exploring how memories and a search for identity come together through research investigating partition in personal and profound ways. The panelists will present their work and engage in a discussion focusing on the role of oral history and archival material in their creative processes and practice of making an expression in film writing and visual art. This will be followed by a discussion moderated by Urvashi Butalia and a Q&A session. The bios of all the panelists will appear in the chat box at the bottom of your screen. Through the session, if you have any questions, comments, or observations, please use the Q&A box again at the bottom of your screen to share the same. And now I hand it over to you, Urvashi, to begin today's session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Sneha. Hi, everyone, and thank you all for being here. I'm delighted to be moderating this panel because the work of the three artists we're going to be talking about today is so interesting and so fascinating. And it's very seldom that you get a chance to actually have three people working from completely different standpoints on the same subject. And there's resonances between them, as I hope you'll see, are pretty amazing. So I'm going to just introduce the subject a little bit. As somebody who has been involved in research on partition for several decades, sometimes I joke and say I've become like the partition lady, but in many ways, this history, which I have pretty much lived with all my life, even though I was born some years after partition. But nonetheless, as all of you know in your work, it's not a history that easily leaves those of us who are from North India particularly. It's not a history that you can easily leave, and it comes back to haunt you in different ways. And I think we're going to be talking about some of those ways today. Our panel today is intergenerational, quite intergenerational. We spread from or stretch from the quite young to the quite old. That is from Arpita, and going on to Aanchal, and then to Bani, and then to me. Between us, we cover several decades. So what I'd like to do really is to talk a little to set the context. And for me, I think what's so interesting is to see how work on partition has kind of expanded and exploded more or less in the last few decades and the many directions it's taken. I mean, the early works that we were aware of were mainly academic, and not surprisingly, they were mainly by men, and even less surprisingly, they were mainly about men. And the men that they were about, even less surprisingly, were men who held power and made decisions. And that was the history of partition, I think, that all of us knew and all of us still know, although thankfully that has begun to change. One of the things I think that changed that was feminist explorations into partition histories and stories, which came directly out of the feminist movement of the late 70s, early 80s and 90s in India, and which are continuing today. And what they opened up was ways of looking at history from below, ways of looking at the history of people on the margins, and ways of looking at the stories that people had carried with them. So really bringing people into the stories that had up until now been only about leaders and documents and decisions that had been taken at the political level, and looking at how a living history lived out in the lives of people. And the ways in which I think feminists opened up that history, raised another question, which I think becomes really important today, which is what happens to history when it kind of escapes into the world, when it no longer remains the domain and terrain of historians, and when it becomes democratized in the hands of people. And that is something we see in partition history and partition stories in the last 2 or 3 decades. Because what you see is explorations of the things that history has found it very, very difficult to deal with, but which are so much an integral part of our exploration of partition. Things like loss, things like the violence people lived through, things like grief, things like emotions, things like, upturning of people's lives, things like memory, the memories not only of survivors, but also of those who have lived with those legacies, and so many other things. So in a sense, this world has opened up as a result, but not only have we seen the opening up of different kinds of subject areas, but we have also seen the opening up of the terrains in which partition was seen to have unfolded. For example, the early studies and even the early explorations of oral history focused so much on the Punjab, focused on the Hindu, Muslim, Sikh kind of oppositions, confrontations, collaborations, and focused, of course, on the horrors of that time. I use that word in quotes for how loaded it is today. And then you see the opening up, or the slow opening up, and looking at the histories from the East. And then you see the histories moving into Gujarat, and you look at the stories of Sindhis in addition to Punjabis, Bengalis, you start to see the stories opening up in the Northeast, and you see it in the Khasi Hills, you see stories coming up in Assam, you start to see it in Ladakh, in Kashmir, and in so much more in the Dandakarnya parts of Bengal. You start to see stories of minorities, not only of the 3 major communities. You start to see stories of Dalits, of women, of people on the margins, and so on. So another kind of opening up takes place over there. Throughout all of this, one thing that remains, and which is what we are going to see today also, is the ways in which people begin to explore personal histories and personal stories, the stories that have kind of lived on inside families, which in some ways have never found much public expression or much willingness on the part of the public to listen to them. But the explorations start inside families, and today you will see 3 examples of that kind of work. Also, what begins to happen, I think, is that no longer are we bound by the form of the academic, historical, written exploration. That comes to be augmented and expanded by what we see through explorations in art, in photography, in film, in music, in the traditions on food. You see it in graphic stories. These explorations also, because of the arrival of the internet, no longer remain bound by the administrative policies of our countries and therefore located only within national boundaries, but they begin to transcend those, they begin to move under those, over those, and you start to see the production of collaborative stories, discussions on how to teach different and difficult histories which are contested from both sides. And you start to see explorations in the diaspora where communities from our parts of the subcontinent come together in very, very different ways. So, and then of course you start to see another kind of institutional memory that is now being contained inside archives and inside museums. I don't know if many of you know, and I haven't yet explored this, but a few days ago I received a WhatsApp on my phone about Partition Museum opening up now in Kolkata. A physical one to supplement the virtual one. I think that had already happened. You know that there is one already in Amritsar, which is opening a branch in Delhi. But not only the Partition Museum, there are also archival collections such as the 1947 Partition Archive or the Citizens Archive of Pakistan or the Memory Project and so many more things. So there is a way in which these histories are opening up. They are becoming more diverse, more inclusive, and they are enriching our understanding of this really important moment in our lives. And among those explorations, one very significant one is the ways in which young people, particularly generations who have no direct reference to partition, are actually exploring the memories of partition through their family histories and through oral history. Arpita's work as an artist does that through the stories of her family and her grandfather, which she will tell you about. Aanchal's work, her writing, begins with the family story, and then that leads her to many, many other stories. Bani's work begins with a family exploration, which she thinks is going to be about sport and hockey, but which becomes more and more about partition. So each of these artists is today going to speak to you about their work, and then we will have a conversation. And I think their work needs to be seen against this context of the sort of, the onion-like explorations of partition that are happening. The more you peel, the more there is to see, the more that you learn from it, the more you absorb, the more questions arise, and the more there is to learn. And we are going to start because most partition history still, despite their having expanded so much, tend to focus on the Punjab or start with the Punjab. We're going to do the other thing, and we're going to start with the East. So I'm going to ask Arpita to speak first, the artist, and then we'll ask the writer Aanchal to speak, and then we'll ask the filmmaker Bani to speak, and each of them will take about 10 minutes, after which we will get into a discussion with them. So Arpita, may I ask you to come in at this point and start?
Thank you so much, Urvashi. Thank you so much. First of all, I would like to start with thanking Bangalore International Center for making me a part of this esteemed panel, and I'm absolutely grateful. Though my practice is very young, I always say it's very young practice because it's just been 4 years of me exploring this family history. And there were a few incidents that happened because of which I started digging the family roots, and I'll share all those incidents with you and how those incidents gradually transformed into few experiences and how I responded to them as part of my practice. I grew up in a family of artists who migrated from now Bangladesh, then East Pakistan, before and after partition. And my works revolves around the family history of transit. As a fine arts student during my bachelor's and master's, I was always interested to look at what was happening in the country, the socio-political situation around us, what is happening, why is it happening, and who is it affecting the most. But I never understood why am I interested to look into the idea of nation or identity or migration or the idea of borders. But few incidents that I mentioned earlier happened and that answered few of my questions. So the first incident that happened was during the month of August in 2016, me along with few of my seniors were discussing on the idea of how our body carries a certain kind of memories of a performance on a certain date or on a certain word like a freedom or the date 15th August. What kind of memory do our body carry? And while thinking about that, I recalled one of the memory that was shared to me by my father, which was shared to him by his parents, of my grandfather, who was an artist and who traveled from Srikail, Kumilla, now in Bangladesh, in 1941 to Shantiniketan to study fine arts. But he was so much involved in the freedom struggle that he put a pause into his artistic career, and he became a part of the larger movement. But when he understood that no partition was something really that was something going to happen, and he could not take the fact that now he cannot go back to his home or he can call his motherland as his motherland. So with that, he performed an act which became a point of departure in my practice. So in 15th August 1947, as we all know, our then Prime Minister Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru was speaking the tryst with destiny. At the same time, Mahatma Gandhi was going through a fast and unnasan in Kolkata. And at the very same time, my grandfather, at a very personal level, he took out all the khadi clothes that he wore, which bore the imprints of the freedom struggle, the movement which he was part of, and gave it away to the river Ganga as Tarpan, with a regret, with a khed, that he cannot accept this independence because it comes with the cost of him leaving his home. So based on that, he writes a poem later, which becomes a point of departure in this performance, where I narrate his poem. I write down the words with the same ink that he used while writing the poem, with the drawings, the memory drawings that you can see at the back of my body, where he draws the line, the rat leaf line from memory. And after the whole performance, I gave away all the clothes that I wore during the performance to the river body nearby. So this experience changed the way I looked into family history, and which was followed by another incident that happened in 1st January 2019. I was invited in Chittagong Art College in Bangladesh to do a performance. And after the performance, my father showed me this diary page from my grandfather's diary, where he wrote down very meticulously, if anyone ever from our family wishes to visit our village, this is a mental map, with even landmarks, to my surprise, which still exist today. And so I and my father, we both were standing in front of the exactly same building, 72 years of difference, which is the Sri Kail College, that he took a photograph of in December 1946, the last time he visited his village. He was constantly documenting all these photographs. Maybe all these places, maybe he knew that it won't be possible for him to come back. And he created a photo album, a series of photo album with all these photographs, which we as family members grew up looking at. But this whole incident of me standing in front of that landmark changed the way I looked into memories. Memories became evidence. And with that evidence, when I came back, as a response to the whole experience, I started developing this work, which is called the Dissected Souvenir, where I weave the family photographs, which was taken by him during and after the partition period of the family members, with the telegrams of the then British government, where they were discussing how the partition will unfold, like how they will divide the community, how they will divide the army. All these details were meticulously present. So in a way, I wanted to bring together, like Urvashi mentioned, that how these personal histories are often lost or dissolved inside the larger picture. So I wanted to bring these two things together, something that was happening into a larger picture in a country level, and something which was happening at a very personal level because of the event. While doing so, I was thinking what kind of a language would be befitting for this. And I came across weaving as a process, where I looked into the warp as one of the memory and the weft as another memory, when they both comes together to create a third narrative. So from this point of time, weaving entered into my practice. The next work that I would like to share is called Transitory Body, the Memory Collector. So I did this performance in Piramal Art Residency. So I found this very bizarre landscape where all these trees were with uprooted roots were buried under a very weird landscape with numbers written in all over the trees. So when I asked, I got to know that as the rule, if you are constructing something in that area, you cannot chop off the tree. So you have to replant the tree somewhere else. So while doing so, it almost became a migratory landscape of all these trees that came out of nowhere and suddenly started occupying that space. I somehow resonated that with my replanted history of my family. And during the performance, I presented a set of stamps to the viewers, which they could make into a digit, which reminds them, a date, which reminds them of any kind of division, dissection, partition, separation. and they can whisper the memory in my ear, and in exchange, I would whisper one of my memory into their ear. In a way, migration of memory would happen. So by the end of the day, my body was fully covered with all these dates of people remembering their past. And from this point onwards, I started calling my body as a memory collector. The next work, The Fall, is as simple as and as complex as it could get. So it's a weaving of the map of India from 1946 with the map of India, Pakistan, and East Pakistan of 1947. So the map that you see at your left is a weaving of the map of India with map of Pakistan. So just the intersecting points are weaved and the rest falls down. And the same happens with the other two panels as well. So I'm keeping this interpretation of the fall open to the viewers to think of what exactly had fallen. The next work that I'm going to share is also part of the same exploration where this work is called The Last Plea, 101 Ways of Crossing, where I'm thinking of the act of crossing, taking reference from how people crossed border from different point of history and making almost like a manual of 101 photographs, 101 ways in which I can cross a border. This particular piece called The Living Scar was a performance that I developed on 17th August 2021. These two scars, which are still living in our country, I inked them on my body, on the two arms of my body, and as these two scars were given on 17th August 2021, we all remember 15th August, but we don't usually talk about 17th August and how that changed everything within a daytime on my body. And now not only this scar lives in my body, but I live within these two scars, as we all live within these two lines in a country. These are some documentations of the work. And at the end, I would like to talk little about the new series of work that I am developing, where I'm looking at the relationship between body, history, body, memories, water body, particularly river, and migration. So I have heard all these stories from my grandparents where we don't have any evidence of. They are just oral stories that I remember. So I don't have a visual reference for them. So I started playing these characters who went through all these events, who went through all these horrible situations. So these are the characters that I developed, which is me playing these characters and standing in front of camera, taking a photograph, almost appropriating a historical photograph, where I weave them with all these rivers which they crossed and then in search of home, and then we don't know what happened to them. Which again takes me to this work, where this series is based on all the characters which I saw in the family albums, who were part of the family, but right now no one remembers them. No one recognizes who they are, because we don't have our grandparents, and people who survive now do not remember who they are. But since they are in the family album, in the family images, so they might be a part of the family, but it's a tribute to all these people who were a part, but now no one recognizes them. And I'll end with my final performance, a performance that I did in the India Art Fair, which was called 360 Minutes of Requiem, where it was again a very simple act of me untying or opening the barbed wire of 360 feet in a 360-minute time. And at the end of the performance, I collected all the open pieces and gifted it to my viewers as a token of remembrance, as they were a part of the performance, as they were a part of the act. So I would like to end.
Thank you so much, Arpita. I mean, you kept amazingly to time, but filled those 10 plus 1 or 2 minutes with so many thoughts and ideas for us to explore as we go forward. So thank you very, very much. You're talking about, I'm just struck by the many threads, when you talk of memory becoming evidence, And then you talk of photographs, you look at different forms of evidence that you have created, photographs, the map, the body itself, the lines on the administrative lines on the map, the ways in which they shape your lives, the ways in which we live within them. And then you end with, I think, three really important key things. One, that borders can be crossed, and there are hundreds of ways of crossing them. And that those barbed wires, which are actually kept to maintain borders, can also be unraveled. And it might take a long time to unravel them, but they can be unraveled. And also that in the middle of these explorations, because here we are exploring personal histories, there are still so many lost histories, which we will not know. And that's those photographs that you put together of people you don't know in the family. So there's the process of recovery is always an ongoing one. Thanks very much for bringing all of those out. And I'm sure many of the things Aanchal will say in her presentation will also resonate with these. So Aanchal, over to you now.
Thank you. Arpita, I have to say, like, my brain and my heart is very full. And we have spoken before, but it's always such a delight to listen to you talk about your work. I am a writer. I write about partition, but I come from a background of fine art. I'm trained as a metal engraver, printmaker. And when I started working on partition, I found myself very inequipped, not only because I wasn't trained to be a historian or even a collector of memory, but also because I found myself unequipped with language to discuss what partition meant. I had grown up in Delhi, studied in the CBSE, and when we learned about partition, it was very much in the way that Urvashi said. It was about archival history, which is one kind of history, the history that is written down of governments and men that made borders. And my first instinct was not to come home and ask my family, oh, did you live through this thing called partition? But it was simply to regard partition as something that was so old that it could not touch me anymore. And it was only in the year 2013, in my early 20s, that I came across objects that my family had carried from Lahore to Amritsar and then to Delhi, and how in touching those objects and feeling them and caressing them and going through the rivets on them or the textures on them, memories seemed to emerge, memories of the past that for most of my life had never been vocalized, they had never been uttered. They talked often about villages and cities. They talked of the names of villages and cities, but never the country of Pakistan that they had once lived in, or Pakistan now. And so I think that as I was sitting and as I was looking at these objects, what emerged was the fact that I required a catalyst to talk about partition, which is what the object became. I first started looking at objects in my own family. They were so mundane. There was ghada, there was a guz, there were small pocket knives, there were utensils that are still used till this day, utensils with initials carved in them, kalai wale utensils. And sure enough, as my grandparents revisited these objects of age, sometimes quite grudgingly because they didn't understand why I wanted to talk about the past, these memories emerged, first about nostalgia, then about loss, then about pain, and about other things. And what I didn't realize at the time was that we were building a new vocabulary to talk about a historical trauma. We were building a vocabulary that was not only verbal, as in language, and what kinds of languages and what kind of dialects memories emerge in, but also non-verbal languages, the language of memory, the language of touch, the language of gesture, the language of movement. And part of me thinks that I became very, I suppose, gravitated to this kind of language because of my background as an artist as well. I was very much trained to be privy to these kinds of things. So I began creating an archive of objects that people had carried, starting with my own family and then moving outward into other people's cupboards and trunks to look at whether we could understand the notion of belonging that still seemed so strong within people through the belongings that remained of that place. And what became very evident very quickly was that there is no one way to tell a partition story, and there is no one way to receive it. And to homogenize the experience of partition is a very dangerous thing, because it includes such a diversity of voices. It is a human history put together, not just of Indian voices, but as I moved towards Pakistan and Bangladesh, it became cross-border voices. And ultimately, I started writing a book about objects called Remnants of a Separation. Sometimes in these interviews with survivors, their descendants, children, grandchildren would join me. And in these interviews, in these multi-generational conversations, interesting things would emerge. Sometimes descendants would know parts of the history. Other times, like me, they would never have heard them. And other times they would add to the story. Oh yes, do you remember you had said this at one point? You forgot Nani, she had told me this. Or they would challenge parts of the history because of what they had understood, either through national archives or films or media, news, knowledge of the 4 wars that India and Pakistan have fought remain at the back of many people's minds in these kinds of conversations. So I think that in these multi-generational conversations, a kind of hybrid remembering would emerge, where the same memory would gain new meaning with new generations. And I think that was very interesting, because we see the ways in which memory is bequeathed down generations, sometimes even in silence, and how younger people make sense of an event that they have not witnessed. And for the longest time, I kind of pushed this research aside as side research, because I didn't think that enough people would be interested in secondhand memory. Already, when you're working with survivors, typically you are told that memory ends at the first generation, that it is never passed down, and you shouldn't dig up old wounds, and mostly. But I did find that memory had found a way to pass and emerge and manifest in very unique ways, either through curiosity, or through regret of never asking before, or through confusion as to how partition happened, how their grandparents or parents lived through it. In some ways, we are all trying to piece together a puzzle that we have not actually witnessed firsthand. And so I found it interesting how younger people were using the aid of so many things, as I was using the aid of objects initially, to create that history. It was very much like a puzzle, because you're trying to make sense of an event so belatedly. And sometimes you come to the realization that it really doesn't make sense at all. And so it was interesting to see them relating to or empathizing with narratives of pain, narratives of loss, fear. There is also anger, bitterness, otherness. There are histories that center around the easy dichotomies of us versus them, or Hindu versus Muslim, or Muslim versus Sikh. But I think that it was very important for this kind of archive to emerge of secondhand memory. And even though I had brushed this history aside as kind of side history, and not knowing whether people would be interested, I did begin to compile a book about it. And it did become quite a tome, because I was surprised at how many younger people wanted to talk about partition. And it is something that I think that we should talk about later on in the discussion, how I was not expecting the response from younger generations, because there is, I suppose, a sort of void that exists within people where your origin is inaccessible and it is on the other side of the border. And this was very much the impetus for many people to start the conversation. And then it grew into other things, cross-border friendships, the exhumation of other kinds of partition histories that are not only about violence, because I think that's another thing that kind of takes center stage with partition, that we are so used to imagining partition as this very, very violent event, which it absolutely was. But there are so many other kinds of narratives of friendship and courage and love and loss and reunion and separation that are also existing in this landscape that are valid and deserve our attention. So I was hearing all these kinds of stories, and I began to write them down, and it became a second book called In the Language of Remembering, that looked at the passage of memory between generations. And I will stop there, but many things to talk about later on in the discussion.
Thank you, Aanchal, again for adding a whole host of other questions. I mean, migrating from art to writing and bringing in that artistic sensibility into your writing. I think that's completely fascinating. And I think your questions about, language, the language of remembering, how to talk about trauma, how to talk about the past from the point of view of the present, who talks about it, and what forms of conversation those are, and also when does that talking begin, when does it end? And the fact that partition survivors, the direct survivors of partition, are pretty much now no longer among us, or at least are not, those who are there are often too old to remember coherently what has happened, but there are other ways in which these memories have been handed down through the kinds of conversations that you were talking about. And one of the questions that I hope you'll think about and respond to earlier, because the scenario, or respond to later, the scenario you were describing of the collective nature of those conversations struck me as something that particularly happens when women are speaking, because it's so seldom that you actually get to speak to them alone. But I'm going to store that question for you to think about and come back to it later. And we'll move on now to Bani, who's a filmmaker and who will tell her story of researching partition, again through her family. Bani, over to you.
Thank you. And thank you, Arpita and Aanchal, for your beautiful presentations. And I can resonate with so much in your stories. And, Aanchal, I grew up in Delhi, and I am remembering myself in class 1 or maybe prep. And the teacher asks, "Where are you from?" And I would not know whether I can say Lahore or Rawalpindi. So I would be biting my, tongue and saying that, because somewhere there was so much jingoism at that point also about the fact that, we were at war once, and the contradictions in my life, that my father loved Lahore, but he was in the Navy. And then the kids would be singing songs about, how we have to defeat the enemy. So, there's a certain kind of split that happens in your mind. And I think I would like to speak about my film. As Urvashi said, it started actually, and I am a bit of an accidental filmmaker because I trained as a space designer. But towards the end of my father's life, he suffered a stroke. And we began to have a conversation about his memories, because when we would speak of the hockey gold, which he had been a part of, because he was a part of the part of India's first hockey team that won the gold, I would find him relaxing. But today I'm not going to really speak about that aspect of the film. My film is called Tang. And Tang is a very untranslatable Punjabi word which means longing. And once you see the film, and towards the end of my presentation we'll see a trailer, you'll see that the longing of my father and the longing of his friends for their homeland is quite evident as it comes out. But today, I think I'm going to take the liberty to speak of the longing of the daughter who makes the film. Because what happened while I was doing this film is that I myself was surprised at the motivation I had to do it. First, I thought I'd just write an article about it because, this story. But very soon I realized that this generation was going. There were only 4 players left from that Indian team that had played. And I did not want to translate their story through myself. I wanted the audience to get it from them directly as they remembered it, because I realized that my generation, because it's closer to partition, had heard those stories directly. But after that generation's gone, I'm going to be telling a story of a story. And I wanted to keep their voice and their And also to sort of, kind of realize that it was after many years that they were breaking the silence sometimes about the partition. And it was a very unique opportunity. And I wanted to share that. So, when I go back, let me share my context. So there's this child who's in class who doesn't quite know how to say where she's from. And when summer holidays come, everybody can go to their village, to their ancestral village, and this child can't. And when she goes home and she asks the family, like, why can't we go to our village? What comes up again and again is, oh, the picture reh gaya, that got left behind. And then the child would say, okay, then why can't we go there? Because very often they would speak of what was left behind with so much love. And then there was this confusion of, then why can't we go there? And they would say no. So there are all these contradictory kind of experiences that are happening. And the home itself is a very crowded place. Like, I never remember the family cooking only for itself. We would always cook for at least 5 or 6 people more, because we never knew who was going to drop in. And I realize now that, my family had found a foothold. There were a lot of people who hadn't. So the experience of growing up was that if it takes a village to grow a child, the village had actually moved into a house. So there would be these conversations which would be recalling the past. They would be about Sufi peers. They would be about history. There would be interpretations of how they had seen certain events, which this child is absorbing. And I didn't quite realize that I would be remembering them. But when I'm making this film with my father, it reaches a point that my father had lost his voice. So in order to have the very complex conversations we had, I had to articulate what I thought he was trying to say. And it became not just a deep dive into his memories, it became a deep dive into my memories of my childhood and what was left of that community and those fragments that gathered in our home in order to sort of create the whole again. So now within this context, let me tell you an anecdote which stayed with me and is also, contributing to why I think I was motivated to start this film. My mother's experience of partition was a very different one. And she often said that partition set her free. And what she meant by that was that the Biradari connections kind of broke and she was allowed to go and work. And in many ways found her voice after partition. So this mother of mine, who's quite young, working very hard, comes back to her home at the end of the day, and the village is there, and she's got to, sort of pull it together and change roles and start looking after people. And so, as you can imagine, she's wearing these many hats and she's quite tired. And in walks this 5-year-old and saying, Mama, can you help me with my history lesson? And she says, no, I can't really read it with you, but you sit in that corner and you read it out to me and I will try to help you. And I said, no, I'm trying to learn this lesson. So she asks me to read it out. And what do I read out? I read out that India was the first country which won its freedom in a non-violent revolution. And she said, stop right there. And she said, who told you that? I said, it's written in my history book. And she said, I will not teach you a history that is not true. And Punjab and Bengal were washed in blood. And we were the price that was paid for this country's independence. And she took my book and she flung it across the room. And she was quite upset. Now, I was very confused by that. I couldn't quite understand why she'd had the reaction she'd had, but I kind of, slipped out of the room and I sort of said, okay, I clearly can't say what my mother's teaching me. I've got to learn it myself. But the child understood that something was missing in the stories that we were learning in our history books. And I think it is in the looking for that gap, the gap that existed in the village I could never go to, the gap that existed in what was not there in the stories that I would hear. But I could hear it and not hear it. There was a presence in the absence. And how do you explain that you were missing something that was never present? But that has been the journey. And then, when you come around and you come to my father and I start doing the research on the film, I am all the time looking for those missing links. And I'm looking for those missing links because I want to create a whole. And, you realize that sometimes a very important project that you work on, you've been getting prepared for a long time before that. And I had worked on the Riyasat-e-Khalsa Museum project as part of the core team. And I was working on the partition galleries towards the end of it. Of course, we were not able to execute the galleries the way I had designed them and imagined them. But in this whole thing of trying to fill those gaps and trying to create the whole again, to try to experience the land of the 5 rivers, because the Punjab that I was born in never had more than 2 or perhaps 3, but it was never the land of 5 rivers. And I was trying to imagine the land of the 5 rivers. And I started curating things that could not be partitioned. So my film then in turn becomes an expression of the curation of what couldn't be partitioned. And when I go to Lahore, sort of following some dots, I start asking the people I meet there that, when I'm talking to the people who are much older, my father's generation, and I say, if you could have something back, what would it be? It could be a moment in your life, or it could be something you would do differently. And again, what would come back to me is, if I could have my Lahore of 1946, and that kind of stayed with me. And then I'm doing some research with the team, the United Punjab team that my father was a part of. And I come to a photograph, which is 1946. And 1946 and 1947, even though Punjab is being torn apart by partition riots, the hockey team lifts the national cup in both these years, that united team. And 1946 is the photograph that I have. And then I look at those images and I see that it is these teammates who in the Olympics of 1948 were supposed to play against one another in the final. In the final, that fortunately never happened because we met the ex-colonial master in the finals and we didn't have to face, but that's what everybody had imagined, that it's this team that's going to now be fighting against one another. So at that point, when I start looking for the missing links in those teams, is how my journey changed from the gold into finding that team. And, and that's how the film came about. But I think it really was about trying to create a whole and trying to understand what the Watan was that my parents lost. And in a sense, through their memories, I'm trying to get it back for myself. So maybe if we can see the trailer at this point, that would.
My father was a member of the Indian hockey team that won the gold at the 48 and 52 Olympics.
JID कौन है? मैं और
But I missed out on knowing him when he was a champion. By the time I understood what hockey was, those days were over. I guess my parents' memories are important to me because in many ways they underpin mine. So my memories are often of their memories and of how I understood their stories. Every time I ask him to tell me about his hockey playing days, he says, "Go meet my buddies."
Welcome. National hockey team, 1948.
United India's team got divided between India and Pakistan.
I think this is Shah Rukh, my classmate. He was very kind indeed. He even spent a couple of nights with me because I said I feel very shaky and frightened. It was very, very bad time, very bad.
He shot the guy. Man.
पापा, ये आपके वो जो फ्रेंड थे ना शाहरुख, I want to get information about him, उनके साथ एक मीटिंग करानी है आप सबकी.
केशव देख रहा बदमाश।
Thanks so much, Bani, for that very moving presentation and for the trailer. So thank you to all three of you. You know, it's each of your presentations is so rich. I'm not entirely sure how to begin and where to begin. And I want to also leave some time for people to ask questions. So let me just try to, put a few things together which you could perhaps respond to, and in whichever order that you want to. So, each of you, the resonances between your work is that you're all exploring family histories, but those family histories are not necessarily the motivation, and yet in some ways they are, and they lead you to the wider history of partition. So they open up for you a history and how it unrolls and unfolds in the lives of people. As artists and writers, where do you go from here? The question that I have is, as a writer, you might write one book and then leave that subject behind, write another book. As an artist, you might work on a concept and then leave it behind and do something else or something different. What I'm, I guess, asking you is, do you think this is a history that will stay with you, that you will be, or will you actually have to carry it with you? And Aanchal, in a sense, you raised this question in your book about why am I so invested in a history that I don't even know? So that's really my question to you. Do you feel a deep emotional connect with this history? Will that connect allow you to move on? Has it enriched the ways you look at things? It's a big question. So you could choose any way of answering it. Who would want to address it first?
I guess I can start. This is a question I've thought about a lot. What happens to a history after it is uttered? Particularly if it has not been uttered for a long time, if it has been preserved in silence. And who carries around that history? And can there be many carriers? In my family, the remembrance of this traumatic past has skipped generations, where I am both bewildered and thankful that I am the preserver of my grandparents' memories, because as Bani said, my memories are made with their memories. Like I can see myself embroidered. I see the scenes of us talking. I can imagine it. And I know that there will not be regret in future generations for not knowing a history. They will not have a lacuna in memory. But I don't think that this history can leave you. I think it very much shapes who you are, because at some point in their stories begins your story. And I wrote Remnants and I said, well, that's it for now. And then I wrote this next book because there is so much residual thinking that happens. There is so much you learn about your own process after a project is done. There is so much other people's reactions of the project teach you about the way that you think or about the way memory works. And I don't think that we are nearly close enough to understanding the full human history of partition. I think verbal language has failed to do justice to it. I think, there is not enough in the native tongue. And this is also something I think about a lot. What happens to people? I think about the interviews I conducted at the beginning when I started, when I had just returned from Canada, so much in English and so hesitant. And towards the end, they were almost entirely in Hindi and Urdu and Punjabi, because the survivor too, at some point, their memories reside in the mother tongue. And in Bani's film, I saw homeland and nation, or motherland and nation, and this incongruence for the survivor is something that resonated with me a lot, how your Vatan and your Desh can be two different things, and you can still be drawn to the Vatan and yet feel loyal to the Desh. answering your question very, putting it together, I don't think I can divorce myself from partition. And sometimes it's a very, I want to very much. I want to, because it feels like you're bearing the weight of so many voices. And I remember the voices. That's what stayed with me. The way people say things, the way they remember, where they laugh, where they break down, where they change languages, where they refer to photographs, where they wish they had photographs. And I think I may take a break from it from time to time, but there is much left to explore with partition still. And every generation, you know, and I think actually I read this in your introduction of the anthology you compiled for partition, the one with the black and white cover.
Yeah, the long shadow.
Right, and you said that anything that is viewed through the prism of memory will never die. There is infinite ways to explore it, because every generation will look at it differently and make new connections with it. So I think that it will not leave me. It cannot. It is in us. I feel it embroidered in the fabric of my life.
Okay, let me ask Arpita. And by the way, to be fair, it was a roundabout question. So answering it in a roundabout way is, I think, okay. Yeah. So Arpita, for you, this history is also, as you say, in your body, and you use the body as a metaphor for it. And the borders, as you say, you know, your body is also the metaphor for where those borders lie. Do you want to talk a little bit about whether you think it will leave you, whether you will leave it? How deeply ingrained in it is it in you?
Mm-hmm. So I start this with, I resonate so much with what Bani said, that where is the village? Because the first memory that goes back of me being in 3rd or 4th grade, where we had summer vacation, and my friends used to ask that we are going to village for the vacation. Where are you going? Where is your village? So at that point of time, that question never made any sense to me, because I had no idea what a village is. So I would come back and ask, what is village, or where is our village? And as everyone mentioned, they will talk about the village used to be like that, there used to be this, we used to do this and that. And I would imagine that, okay, this thing happened, and then I forgot. Later, when I grew older, I realized that my house in Odisha, where I grew up, was Bengal. And when I went out of my house, it was Odisha. And when I came here in West Bengal to study, I felt that I'm not Bengali enough. When I was in Odisha, I felt I'm not Odia enough. And when I visited Bangladesh and I talked with people, I felt I'm not Bengal enough. So all these things of then who I am, and why are my mannerism different from theirs mannerism, and why our family, although they tried very hard to, you know, restore all these idea of Bengal, or idea of what they had in their house, or what they understood the idea of home as. So I am 29-year-old, and till 20-year-old, we were living in rented apartments. So we're shifting house every now and then. And every time we'll shift, we'll pack everything again and take it out to the next house and try to make it look like, remember it like a home that was there. Every time there will be the same photographs, the wall will be changed. There will be the same books, but the cupboard may be changed. So this shift, these transitions in identity is something that I realized with very small things, like why my grandfather used to eat dal at the end of his meal, my grandmother or grandfather. I could never understand, because we start with dal, right? When I went to Bangladesh and I saw how they serve food and they drink dal at the end, I somehow related that eating dal at the end was his way of restoring home inside him. So, you know, looking at all these tiny details, which I observed, but which I never thought of, which are now coming back as flashbacks, and which no one else in my family are bothered to talk about, which is very sad. And I really want to thank my grandparents, especially my grandmother, because my grandfather, I was very young. I was 11-year-old when he passed away. So all these memories, in a way, are passed on by her. to my father and then to me, and with all these materials. So yeah, I think it was not just to search for the idea of home, but also to search who I am and where I belong and where I stand. So I don't think I'll be able to divorce myself from it, as Aanchal also mentioned, because somehow carrying all these memories also of people who interact with me during my performance or during my show, when they come and they say that I think you are the right person to hand over my family archives because no one else is ever bothered about it, and we will lose it if I won't give it to you because you will value it. So things like that, when they come from front, I don't know what to do about that yet, but I feel that connection, and that connection, we thought that for this generation, I'm often asked this question that you have never experienced it, so why would you like to go back time and again? But when I find people like this, when they come and they find this connection between them, may not be a partition survivor, maybe an other event from the history, but they come because they know the idea of loss, because they're aware of the idea of loss. It might not be just the partition, but loss in various forms, which will always connect, which will always be there. So yeah, that's what I think.
Thanks so much, Arpita. Actually, you've answered that beautifully, but you said something which leads me to another question I wanted to ask you later, but since you said it, let me ask you now. You said that the memories of your grandfather were really passed down to you through your grandmother, because your grandfather died when you were quite young. But what about your grandmother's memories? Did you ever try to collect those? Because I'm struck by the presence of grandfathers and fathers in your work, all three of you. And I'm just looking for where the other stories are. So did you try to collect your grandmother's stories? What were her memories like?
Yeah. So because my grandfather memories were in a physical form, they were photographs, they were writings, they were something I could come back to suddenly. So that was very easier for me, to be very honest, to work upon. But with my grandmother, I had a relationship like when there was power cut. So she would, I would sleep near her, and she would turn this hand fan, and with that she'll start talking. And when she's telling story, it was never a Raja Rani story or a mythological story. It was always Noakhali Rayot. How she took a boat, how their family took a boat to cross the river, in order to find a safe place. It was always that, but it was in the darkness. During that point of time when things were literally vulnerable, So the memories of my grandmother are in the form of conversations that I have, which do not have a physical evidence, so as to say, but they're just present in my memory. And yes, I'm working towards a new project where I'm working with my maternal as well as my paternal grandmother's histories. It will be like a history of 10 women from the family who faced partition at that point of time. But few of the members were very young. My grandmother's sister was very young, so she does not remember anything during. She remembers everything after partition, when they came to Kolkata and what happened after that. So it's very interesting to see how the story traveled from, like, I also have a before partition story, I also have a after partition story. So I'm trying to connect these dots together through this project. As I also mentioned that my research is just 4-year-old, and also which has 2 years of COVID time. So it got a bit delayed. But I'm looking forward to explore Borisal, because my grandmother, she was from Borisal, and to explore more stories.
Thanks a lot. And I find that story fascinating, of her sitting in the dark with the fan and in the dark telling you about Noakhali. And that leads me to a question I want to ask Bani. I mean, Bani, the broad question of whether this history will ever leave you or whether you will ever want to leave it is there, of course. But over and above that, there's another question which I was reminded of when Arpita was talking about, and it is a question that Aanchal raises in her book also, and she did in her talk about the difficulty of talking about violence. You know, in many ways, what each of you has referred to, and that's so true about partition, but it's not the whole thing, as all of us know, is this tremendous nostalgia for something that was left behind, which then becomes the longing to go back to, and which in some way wipes out the difficulties and resentments and bitternesses and inequalities that must have been there. And of course, when one remembers, that often happens. But even with you, when you're talking to your father, you know, that incident that's in his head of violence in the film that he tries to recount, and you try to help him with it. So I think, how can we move beyond the nostalgia and find a language to talk about violence? Is it even possible, or is that the reason why we hesitate, or we don't, or why so much of the talk is nostalgic? Is there no vocabulary? Is there no language? Is it difficult intergenerationally to talk about violence? Can it only be talked about in the dark? You know, all of these questions which have come up through your presentations.
Yeah, that's the only way. I mean, I've thought about this quite a bit, and I feel there used to be so many gaps in the way they spoke of their homeland or their watan or the village they left behind. There would be these silences at some point, and they would go into a reverie. And I knew even as a child that I should tiptoe around this now, because there's something that they don't want to talk about. And they never spoke about the violence, actually, all through my childhood. And interestingly, the only time that my father did talk about that incident, which I recorded in the film, was in 1984. And 1984 was a watershed in my life. I mean, I can really say it's been a before and after experience for me and for many people in my community. And I mean, quite interestingly, I mean, we don't really discuss it, right? So, so what is another experience of, growing up? I mean, if you look at, because I was able to work on Virasat-e-Khalsa, I had the opportunity to look at 500 years of my community's history. And, because it's located in the northwest of India, something that comes up is that there are many, many periods in this history where there's violence, there are wars, and all through childhood, there was this gentle nudge to keep moving on. Jada sochna nahi hai. Don't think too much, just keep moving on. And what does it do when it's a whole population that is actually growing up on that? Because it's a history that's painful. You don't want to call, you have to move on, you have to live here. So you don't talk about it. 1947, let it be, even 1984 is not discussed anymore, And in 1984, when I was in college and I would suddenly come in, and my father was one of the most positive people that I knew. I would come into a room and all the lights were off and he's sitting in the dark. It would be a bit disturbing to actually see him like that. And I would flick a light on and say, Papa, what are you thinking about? And like your grandmother, time would collapse and he was talking of 1947. It was exactly the same. And that's when some of these stories came out. And even the story about, Keshav saying something was missing about the gold. It came out because that day at the shoot was really bad. He was agitated, he was disturbed, he was tired, he was trying to focus on, retrieving this memory from 75 years ago, and something or the other was going wrong. And then I asked him, so, what happened after you won the gold? And of course, I was expecting that usual answer about how they were thrilled and elated. And he said, no, something was missing. We weren't really happy. There wasn't really so much of a celebration. And I was like, where did this come from? But my point is that always stayed with me, that, what came out on that day, because every time I tried to go back to that on later occasions, he would say it was happy, it was wonderful, we were all overjoyed. But that is the reason I started studying, that why did he say that? And then I come to this 1946 photograph. And then I realized, if you're going to be playing against your best friend, how are you going to be happy when you won that gold alone? You had dreamt of winning it together. And that's, hockey became my metaphor to understand what had happened to our country at independence. And after having worked on this project, even though I thought I understood my parents, my mother and my father, there were so many bits of that jigsaw puzzle that were coming together in a very different way with the missing links that I was finding. When I went to Lahore, I could never quite place my parents in the Punjab that I experienced, because my parents had a worldview. They were very cosmopolitan, my mother and my father. And I couldn't quite locate them in Chandigarh or Ludhiana or Jalandhar whenever we went. But when I went to Lahore, I knew, oh, this is where they were from. It all just came together. So I think, to go back to your question of, whether this telling of the story and, do I carry on with it or do I do something else? I completely resonate with what Aanchal says, because I think ever since I was a child, I feel the story found me. I didn't quite find the story. Because I think out of my generation, I was the one who was asking a lot more questions than everybody else. And even in the making of this film, it's in many ways been a blessed journey. Doors have opened when others have shut, and things just kept falling into place. So I think I felt fortunate that I got a chance to do this project when I was much older, because there was a sense of, okay, can I move out of the way and let the story tell itself? And I think for me, it's very, very important to be able to pass on that understanding that I got of my parents, in a much fuller way, because I'm thinking of my daughter. And if we are only going to rely on history books to teach us the history that my mother so violently opposed, there are gaps even now, and we need to figure those out ourselves. And we have to take charge of our own stories. Because when I went to Lahore, I saw grandmothers in every face that I saw, right? Because there is that collective history. And if we at least don't try to understand it from that perspective, and then accept that we have, parted ways and we've gone separately, but to almost act like we've never had something common, how do we get a vantage point or a perspective from which to understand?
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Thank you for that. We do have to take charge of our own stories. I have 101 other questions for you, because in each response you raise many other questions. And we haven't even begun to talk about home and longing and, the healing that comes from going back and so on. But I'm very conscious of the time. So let's open it up and take in some audience questions, if there are any. Sneha, will you tell us about those questions? How do we access them?
Sure.
Oh, okay. Do you want me to go to the Q&A or, yeah?
I can read them out.
Okay.
So the first question is to Bani. Actually, someone wants to know where we can watch the documentary if it's available. Bani, you're on mute.
I try to screen it as often as I can. So, the next screening is in Delhi on the 23rd at IHC. And I keep posting every time I'm able to organize a screening on my Instagram. So I think if people follow Tang Project on Instagram, then they'll get information. But I'm trying to find a online platform, but I don't have anything as yet.
I think a lot of people are interested in watching, and it would be great if there is an online, platform where that can be done. So, all right, I'll move on to the next question. This is from Indra Chaudhary. This is for all of you. She asks, since all of you have worked with inherited memories that are often so overwhelming, she was wondering if in some ways it evacuates and displaces your own experiences, something Marianne Hirsch wonders about when speaking about post-memory in the context of the Holocaust. Looking at your work, I'm thinking that the imagination perhaps creates and opens up a space that enables you to insert yourself and your experience into the past. How would you respond?
I think everyone's work actually resonates with that, Indira. So, but who would like to respond? Aanchal, do you want to? Because you specifically address this in your work as well.
And I think actually all of us have addressed it in part in our answers already, that how it changes the way we view the world. I am really interested in this word displaced. Displaces your own experience, because this is something I think about a lot, and why I am the one who is obsessed with this history, but also displaces the way I think about recording oral history. There is a small anecdote with my grandmother and me, where my paternal grandmother is someone that I literally turn to for any kind of story, or the first questions I have about partition are addressed to her. And I remember at one point, about 2 years ago, we were having this conversation about whether, if after partition, someone like me or someone like an oral historian or a journalist would have gone around and wanted to talk to people about things or about what they had witnessed, whether she would want to talk to them. And her response, like outwardly, was no, absolutely not. And I said, why was it too painful? Would you think that you needed time? And she says, even now, when you ask me, why do you assume that I always want to talk about it? Why do you want to consciously and continually go back into the past? Which really kind of made me, I felt really like as if I had asked all these years about something that had not wanted to be answered. I don't know if I'm making complete sense, but so then she said, even when you ask now, after I tell you, I keep thinking about that world, and I keep going back to that time. And then I thought about how many times we have together returned to the refugee camp. We have together returned to taking the trains. We have together returned to standing on the platform where her mother wanted to go back to Pakistan because she wasn't treated with respect in India. It had been 2 days, but she was so adamant, I want to go back. And it really, I suppose it really displaced my sense of asking the question. Like, does this question need to be asked? And I asked her, like, would you rather I not ask you questions at all? And again, she said no. And then very quickly she said, no, I mean, you should, because if you don't, then maybe no one will. And I don't really have a conclusive thing I'm trying to say, but it really made me think about what happens when we ask questions and what happens to those who give answers. Yeah. And this is something I know you talk about as well in your work, Urvashi.
Urvashi, you're on. Yeah.
No, actually, I wasn't going to say. I was going to say Indira knows well what I'll say, so I'll abstain. Should hear from all three of you, not me. So, if there are other questions, Neha.
Yes, there's a question from Deepak Muradda, who asks, given that records on both sides of the border of divided India are not properly retained, have any of the panelists discovered how we can access archives in the UK, perhaps? And is it likely that those records would be better preserved and may help some of us partition's grandchildren trace our roots from the threads that we still have?
I can talk about that. Yes, there are many records in archives, not just in the UK, but across the world. But by this archive, I mean the official archive of politics and dates and politicians. That's the archive you will find. There are some digitized records at the British Library and at SOAS, and also in, no, that's it. But there are also some things you will find in the National Archives in India, and also the Lahore Museum, which has a basement full of things that hasn't been searched through fully. However, the real archives that may give you some information about your family or stories like your family are things like the 1947 Partition Archive that record human histories across the world, which may resonate more, and they are online as well.
Thank you for that. I'll move on to the next question by Rohini Bhola. She says that, I wonder why none of my family members who went through a horrific time in partition have no angst. They only shared, if at all, happy memories of their early years. And when I asked about the violence, my mom would say that was politics. Is this common amongst the stories that Aanchal, you have collected? And if yes, why do you think that is so?
Well, it's one kind of story. Like I said, there's no one way to remember. So while some people do remember violence, other people choose to remember things like friendship or hope or resilience or rebuilding. It is, however, common to immediately refer to the nostalgia. And where there is space and language to be found for nostalgia, other things need to be exhumed with delicacy over time, more than often with the help of another generation asking the questions. What else was in the question? Sorry.
It says that was this a common response where, even though the history is that of also of violence, people remember other things like friendship, and was that a common response?
Yes, and I think also Bani answered quite a bit of it in her answer recently as well. So yeah.
I think also, just to add to what Aanchal is saying, and she said it already, there's no one kind of response. People have different ways of remembering. And also talking about violence is very, very difficult, especially talking about violence if you have lived through it. It's even more difficult. And talking about it to your families, for example, if you just take that question into looking at the sexual assault that so many women faced, how would they speak about it? What words would they use? Where would the vocabulary be? In a culture where we can't even talk about sex openly, or we can't even talk about our bodies openly, that will never get articulated. And if it doesn't get articulated, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. But it is entirely possible also that the experience of one family or several families could be a positive experience of that time and didn't have violence, and therefore they won't speak about it. So there could be many reasons of it.
I also want to add that often oral history interviews, the recollection of memory is quite non-linear. So the interview may in itself contradict what it has said earlier on, and where there are stories of hope, stories of violence can emerge later as well. The one thing I remember from my research was this gentleman in New Jersey who, in passing, had mentioned to his family that there had been so much violence on the way of his trying to find his family that his family thought he had died, and they had burnt an empty pyre, as a last kind of, they had burnt an empty pyre because the body didn't come and they really didn't know where he was. And the only way he found to talk about what he had witnessed along the way was to, I remember him saying things like, in the village of Manu Majra, which is the fictional village in Khushwant Singh's train to Pakistan. And I don't know if he realized what he was doing, but that was the only language he had to talk about it. And to talk about what he had seen, it was very much directly taken from the book, or obviously something he had read later on, but it had been transposed onto his personal experience.
Thank you. I'll move on to the next question, which is quite interesting. Barira asks, have any of the women in your interviews, if any of you have come across women through your research or in your interviews, specifically pointed to problems that they faced just because of being a woman, because they were women during the migration or during partition?
Perhaps, Urvashi, you should take this question.
Okay. Yes, Barira, the short answer to your question would be yes. I think pretty much every single woman that I interviewed would have would have lived through that experience or pointed to issues specifically or particularly because she was a woman. This doesn't only have to do with women who lived through sexual assault and rape, but it has to do, for example, with women who were widowed, with women who were abandoned by families, with women who were with families, but who had to move and who had, for whom the nature of how should I say it, space, the spaces in which they lived changed drastically. The street became their home. They had to cook and sleep and live and walk and work on the street. And that created certain kinds of vulnerabilities to attack, abduction, and so on and so forth. The ways in which women were rendered alone by this history, in the sense that they, for example, if the moment of marriage passed and then they became single in a family, in a newly forming nation where the family is adjusting to a new life, and the woman is therefore often the most dispensable part, even for girl children who were who faced difficulties in being adopted because they were girls, even for those women whose lives actually changed in a positive way because of partition. Women whose lives, Bani talks about her mother who was otherwise constrained or would otherwise have been constrained by the kind of patriarchal life setup that women are caught in. And when a cataclysmic moment like this changes all that, it throws you sometimes into the public world and becomes an occasion where you can, as many women said, we were able to spread our wings. So there are so many different kinds of experiences that happen, which are specific to women being women. I hope that answers your question in some way.
Yeah, thank you, Urvashi. I'll take one final question, and this goes to all of you. Where Anita is wondering if there is any material or pedagogy being developed for young people. I think she means in the context of being able to talk about partition and the history of partition. And if any of you are working on anything in that regard.
Sneha, can I respond to that? But before that, if any of you would like to, Bani, Aanchal, Arpita, would you like to go first? I can come in after.
No, I said go ahead.
I think there are attempts. One of the tragic things is that I think our textbooks, which were for use for kids in schools, have, I think, taken out some lessons on partition. They've been deleted now. But there are groups of teachers across the country who are trying to develop alternative syllabi and alternative ways of looking at partition in their own local contexts. I was recently in a meeting with several of these teachers who had developed different kinds of workshops, work exercises, and so on. And you will find some of these on the website of an organization called History for Peace, which is, or Peaceworks. It's the same organization. I don't know what the website runs under, but they work with teachers who are trying to develop different kinds of ways of teaching alternative histories. There have been discussions under the auspices of the same organization with people across borders to try and develop ways of talking about difficult histories. And these discussions are modeled a little bit on the ways in which France and Germany, for example, came together to talk about how history seen differently from different vantage points can be taught in schools, and multiple histories can be taught, and students can be given the possibility of locating their own understandings of it, and how you can do interesting exercises and workshops with students, which can open up these histories for them. So there are some initiatives like this, which sadly, because the school system is not so open to them, are located outside of the school system and can be done if the teacher is proactive and if she gets support from the powers that be in her school. There are also some books, I think, that are written for young people, with partition as a theme. I remember seeing one of them recently, which is a graphic story called Chotu, but I haven't seen much more, but I know there are some. So it's worth exploring that as well.
Just one more thing to add to it. A couple of years ago, something very original happened from LUMS in Lahore, which is University in Lahore, and Jindal School of Journalism in Delhi. They had a combined session taught by Professor Ali Usman Kasmi in Pakistan and Pallavi Raghavan in India about the way in which we look at shared history. And needless to say, it busted a lot of myths and it fostered a lot of understanding of what our shared history was. But it was at the university level, which I think maybe, and it managed to pass under the radar. And it proved to be a very insightful course. But yeah, History for Peace is an excellent resource. They have all kinds of lectures also on their website, and they work with practitioners in the field to try to teach teachers how to teach history in a more creative and inclusive way, cross-border. So, yeah.
Great, thank you for that question. This is some very important information, for the next generation to learn about this history and about partition. Thank you all for your time today. With that, I will have to come to an end for this session. Urvashi, Aanchal, Bani, and Arpita, thank you for sharing your work and your thoughts and your insights with us. It's been a wonderful session. Thank you, Urvashi, for moderating the session as well.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.